Joe touched on the whole point of the trust between public and private sectors as we deal with the whole issue of climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. So our previous mayor in Boston, Tom Menino, in 2009/2010, really felt that he needed to outreach to more in the private sector and in the non-for-profit community to support his agenda on not only climate change mitigation but adaptation. So he talked to Amos Hofstetter, who, as Brian Sweat mentioned, had been a businessman. Amos and his business partners sold their company, Continental Cablevision, for a little bit more than $10 billion, B, not M. And Amos put his money into a private family foundation to support the arts, universities, and also environmental issues. And when he and the mayor talked, they decided that it would be good to set up something which we now call Boston's Green Ribbon Commission, which is a group of business, institutional, and civic leaders who are committed to shared strategies for helping to implement the city's climate action plan. There are 34 of us on the committee, and as Brian mentioned, they come from all different fields, in business, in architecture, in healthcare, in transportation infrastructures, at the universities, and also in healthcare. And the committee is also very diverse from an ethnic, social economic background. 6 of the members are members of color. So it's 20% are people of color. And in our city, there's a very strong commitment to involving all people so that it's reflective of our population overall. And in fact, the members of color, in fact, include the former head of the American Red Cross of Eastern Massachusetts. So she had great expertise on emergency preparedness. It includes the Chancellor of the University of Massachusetts, Boston. It includes the President of the Boston Architectural College, which grooms a number of our architects and landscape architects. And it includes the President of App Associates, which is one of our largest consulting organizations in Boston, has more than 800 consultants working for them. So a very diverse in every sense of the word committee. There is also a number of partners that support the work of the Green Ribbon Commission. We had funding from 7 sources, including the Bank of America Foundation, which is a very large foundation, the Boston Foundation, which is a regional foundation here, and 5 family-based foundations, again, in Massachusetts. There are a number of partnerships that are part of the Green Ribbon Commission, not only the City of Boston, which Brian mentioned, but also Renew Boston, a national group called Healthcare Without Harm, which works with the healthcare sector to be sure that they do no harm and also to green that sector. And then A Better City, which is here locally, which works with property owners to reduce energy use and water consumption as well. So in February of 2013, my employer, the Boston Harbor Association, released our report called Preparing for the Rising Tide. And it was based on our analysis of what might happen between now and 2100. And we had developed maps in 2010. We actually used those maps to relate what would have happened if Hurricane Sandy had hit Boston 5.5 hours earlier at high tide, and the devastation would be quite extraordinary. And Brian mentioned that earlier. So out of that effort, working together with the mayor, in 2013, the Mayor Menino at that time asked that a working group be formed within the Green Ribbon Commission that looked at the whole issue of climate change preparedness and adaptation. And 12 of us serve on that working group. We met 3 times between June to December of 2013, and we came up with a draft plan which was briefly discussed at our last meeting of the working group and will be formally adopted later on this year. And I want to share with you the 6 recommendations from that report. The first is we need to start planning now for the long-term impacts. So you've heard Brian and others here talk about the need for re-engineering of the city's building stock and also the associated infrastructure. And we obviously have heard these last 2 days, some of the things that can be done. But what came out of our document was the need not only to start to prepare, but to come up with a process to design the process by which the planning can be done. So our working group is going to recommend that in the 2014 updated climate action plan that Brian Sweat talked about, that we lay out a structure and a process to engage key stakeholders in a long-term resilience planning and design work, including not only the buildings, but also the infrastructure investments and also large-scale solutions. You've heard others talk about, do we build a whole barrier like, has been suggested for New York City? Do we do that around Boston? And may or may not want to do that, but the whole planning for what we can do, not only on the city level, but working with the members of the legislature and such, needs to be thought about. And the planning needs to have different time frames. So we have when we go out in the development committee, we talk about sort of this short term. What did we do between now and 2030, 2040, 2050? And then obviously, what do we do long term to 2100? So that's the first recommendation. The second is, how do we help property owners reduce damage and the recovery time? And as part of the effort of the Green Ribbon Commission and the Barr Foundation, which is Amos Hofstadter's family foundation, the Boston Society of Architects was commissioned to do a report called Building Resilience in Boston, which debuted last year. And they identified 30 measures that can be done by building owners and operators. And no one has endorsed them per se. The business community said, you're not making us do all these. We said, no, these are some options that can be considered. And it includes everything from looking at the site, what you might do for building for higher rain flow, creating cool ground surfaces, flood-proofing your sites and your buildings, using hard infrastructure to prevent flooding, using hazard resilience landscape design, green landscaping as we call, providing shade. So that's what you can do for the site. Then the other area was building structure, enhancing the structural elements for extreme loads. Another category is the whole issue of building enclosures, using cool roofing, enhancing the building insulation, using a lip when you have an underground parking facility. A fourth area is building systems, again, the resilient backup power and systems, resilient heating, cooling, ventilation systems. As was discussed last night at Spalding Rehab, the whole issue of opening windows and such, what David Burson and Hubert Murray discussed. And then also related to that, of course, is building operations. Again, both David and Hubert discussed some of that yesterday. But even the idea of having emergency communications plans, not storing your building plans in a computer on site, because as we all know from Hurricane Sandy, they couldn't get to the building plans because they couldn't get to the buildings because the systems were closed. So even having a set of plans off-site so that, God forbid, if something does happen to your building, you can plan for that as well. And then the whole issue of what we call people, educating households, partnering with local community organizations, being sure that you reach out to the most vulnerable communities and most vulnerable members. So one of the things that Brian Sweat is looking at very closely, working with their Public Health Commission here in Boston, is to be sure that vulnerable populations like those who might have asthma, the seniors, they may or may not have a smartphone. They may or may not communicate in the way that all of us are used to communicating on our laptop with our smartphone texting. How do we be sure that those vulnerable populations also get the information and the message? And I think, when Joe showed the PSA from the First Lady, that actually is the communications people would say that is a way of reaching, quote, the older population. Not to say that none of us watch PSAs or watch television, but certainly if you look at the demographics, the younger people, those 20, in their teens and such, are not getting their information per se from television. But the more vulnerable populations actually do. So I think that what you've talked about is a very important public service as well to reaching vulnerable populations. Okay. A third thing that the third recommendations was support building resilience. And, that can mean one of the things that we learned in our process of mitigation was that we did not get as much feedback as we should have as we move forward through the political process. So Brian mentioned that there's a survey of existing buildings and how resilient they are. There was actually pushback from the business community, and particularly from the smaller building operators about having to do these complicated inventories and about sharing information. Why should I tell you? Then she's going to know how we do in our building. And there was a lot of pushback, and it had to go back twice to City Council. And then the second time, it was not a given, but we all mobilized and such, and it did pass the City Council last year, the reporting mechanism. But it was really a wake-up call for those in government that you really have to bring in those who are directly affected throughout the process. So a better city, which includes a lot of the members in the real estate community, agreed that they would sort of take the comments from the business community and then share it back before the city moved forward. And that was a very valuable lesson that we learned in hindsight. Dictating what you're going to do is not always the best way to do it, because those who actually have to fill out the forms are saying, we don't have the staff to do it. What do you mean? All the buildings that we manage, these little condominiums that have 6 units each, now we have to report. So things like that were really important, and it was a good lesson for us in terms of building broad support and participation. The other thing that happens is people just ignore the survey form. Okay, you're going to make this, we have to do this? Fine. We're not filling it out. What, are you going to put us all in jail? You're going to fine all of us? So it's being sure that it's something that's doable, getting that input, and also getting the buy-in as well. So that was very crucial as well. And just so you know, some of the things that we actually talked about in requiring the building survey was basic building information. The resilience to higher temperatures and heat waves. How they can reduce the heat island effects, on-site power, smart grid systems, non-mechanical strategies, and then things like the elevation, the ability to occupy without utility power, ground floor elevation, prevention of water penetration, things like that we in the industry, we who deal with these issues all the time, what's a big deal? But for a lot of the building operators, they just could not do that. So it was a good learning lesson for us in terms of how to work together. Here in Massachusetts, our building code is a state building code. So the city of Boston cannot modify its building code by itself. We have to get the legislature to approve it. And so one of the things that we are looking at as we think about the whole issue of resilience is how do we forge that regional approach so that there will be support to even looking at whether there should be modifications in the building code. You heard Mayor Walsh talk about the regional approach yesterday. You heard Brian Sweat today talking about it. As we think about how we adapt the building code statewide, and it's not just Boston as a coastal city, but that would also affect communities, on the North Shore. It could affect, Fall River. It could affect Gloucester. And people are saying, so what are we going to have to do in those communities as well? And how do we think about these issues? And do we have the funding to do this type of planning? So that is why this new mayor is really talking about being a regional leader in terms of these issues, so that over the long term, and all elected officials don't just think of serving one term. Sometimes you only do get to serve one term. But if there is an opportunity to serve more than one term, sort of build that space. And I think Mayor Walsh is also realistic in understanding that if there's even any talk about changes or modifications to the statewide building code, it's not happening in 1 year or 2 years. It will take a greater coalition of support involving the business community as well, and involving property owners. So, but he's starting to build that, and we think it's something that's very important. In the short term, though, the city does have control over what we call the Article 80 zoning process. And so all of the large projects in our city have to go through this Article 80 review process. And in that process, the Boston Redevelopment Authority is asking all large projects to identify what they are doing in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also what they're doing in terms of climate change preparedness. And so that's already starting to get developers to think about it. But more importantly, their consultants think about it as well. And most of the consultants, whether it's engineering consultants, whether it's the architects, represent more than one property or project. And so they build on each project. So they know that groups like mine, for example, will, when it goes through a public review process, will say, excuse me, so what are you doing with that underground parking garage? Is the water going to go in? You know, you show some vents on the side. How's that going to work? And right now, as for those of you who've had the opportunity to walk around, we're in the midst of a very large construction boom here in Boston. There are more cranes, and not quite as many as in Shanghai, where the crane is the major bird. But we have a lot of cranes, and we're very fortunate. And so the contractors, the construction companies, the architectural firms, you know, the engineers all know that they're going to be asked for that, to describe what they're doing. And so they're really thinking about it and coming up with some creative solutions, taking what the Boston Society of Architects and others have suggested and really implementing it in the design of the building. And even we're bringing in a lot of the landscape architects as well to think about greening sites. So in Eastern Massachusetts, our gaming commission is going to be licensing potentially up to one casino in Greater Boston. And one of the casino sites is right on the water on the Mystic River in Everett. Steve Wynn is proposing that and hopes he gets a gaming license. But it was amazing. In the last 3 months, they have come up with a plan to calling it the Living Coastline, where they are actually greening that part of their site. It's a 32-acre brownfield site, and they're using marsh grass. They're setting a buffer area. So it's not just making it pretty from a landscaping perspective, but actually thinking about what they might do for adaptation. And this is a casino operator. So they're not the traditional type of tenant or client that one would think about on these issues, but we are seeing some very progressive activities in that way, which I think is heartening. And so on the one hand, people roll their eyes casino, but I say they're positive things, and this is an example, and they've already paid for the work. Think about how you might be able to do something like this as well. A fourth thing is aligning the market and the financial incentives. And Alex has already talked about that, so I'm not going to go into detail about that. But what we are doing in Boston is to work with the insurance brokers and the property trade associations to educate the property owners about risk and resilience. And we're also working with the state insurance commissioner to encourage climate-smart insurance policies. So a lot of what Alex already talked about, you know, are things that we're trying to get here in Massachusetts as well. The fifth is making our infrastructure resilient. And as Brian Sweat mentioned earlier today, we don't control all of our infrastructure, right? So, you know, our subway system doesn't just stop at the boundaries of Boston. For those of you at the Hyatt who came in by the T today, you were in Cambridge, right? And so our transit system goes regionally. Our wastewater, the way when you took your shower this morning or flushed the toilet, it goes through pipes that are owned locally, but it goes to a regional treatment facility that serves 43 communities in the greater Boston area at Deer Island. And that treatment facility, actually by coincidence, was raised more than a foot high when it was constructed, not for climate change, but actually because that was the way that the system had to work to run. So if you come back to Boston ever, they will give you a tour of the Deer Island treatment plant. We run an education program with inner city youth every spring and fall. And when you bring out high school teenagers from the inner city, the last thing on a field trip, they like to be out of school, but to say, we're going to a wastewater treatment plant, their eyes sort of roll. Okay, and you can imagine, particularly the boys, but I will tell you, our treatment plant, the major smell is the chlorine. It's not the other stuff that's being treated, which is amazing. And also how we've greened, again, the site. We have paths, 5 miles of open path around the treatment facility. It's actually fenced in, so the treatment facility itself, we would make an exception, let you as government officials come in from local and state agencies, but the public can walk around 5-mile path around the treatment facility, which is pretty extraordinary and a pretty progressive way of thinking about our infrastructure as well. And then the last thing is to accelerate the communication strategy. So the FEMA maps, the draft FEMA maps, which came out last fall, confused the public even more because more than 8,000 properties would be affected by the maps that were shown in Boston if they were to go into effect. And of course, you can imagine for property owners, oh my goodness, am I in this? Do I have to pay for it? Can I sell my home? I'm about to sell my home. What is this going to do? So the City of Boston, through the Boston Redevelopment Authority, put into their budget funds, which was approved by the BRA board at the end, the last meeting under Tom Menino's administration in December, a consultant to help the city actually look at the FEMA maps to determine whether the maps were designed in a way that was done correctly. And the report will come out shortly, and the report for the city will actually be within the appeal period. So if the consultant finds that the methodology for some reason was faulty or should be looked at in a different way, we will have that information so the city can do the appeal. But what happened was, from all that happened with Hurricane Sandy, the visual images that we saw here of the devastation that occurred in New York and New Jersey, and then a year later, you have the FEMA maps. You can imagine the confusion for the general public and even property owners. Not everyone is a Boston Properties. Not everyone is a Beacon Capital where you have people at that level of sophistication. We have a lot of very small property owners as well as residential property owners. And so getting that communication strategy out there, working together. And I love, as Joe showed, that PSA. I mean, as he was showing it, I'm saying, I wish I could see the second one because that's actually something that might be useful for us to share. And just to close, on our Green Ribbon Commission, we have, for example, the head of one of the largest ad agencies, PR companies in Boston, Mullen Advertising, and they have helped us with some of the promotional materials. But I love the fact of involving the First Lady, and so I always learn when I come to these sessions. So thank you very much for including us, and again, enjoy your stay in Boston, and we hope that you can come back in the future to see some of the efforts that we have underway. Thank you.